The ninth pick in the 2023 NBA Draft will be made by the Utah Jazz.
Hey, welcome on in. It's a Sunday Mother's edition of The Zone. We're live and local for the NBA Draft Lottery. Scott Garrard alongside Ben Anderson, as we will give you the picks as they announce the order of the upcoming NBA Draft. And Ben, I'm excited, man. This is going to be fun. You know what? We get to hang out on a Sunday. Happy Mother's Day, by the way.
Yeah, happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there. Neither you or I, obviously, are mothers, but have mothers in our lives, as does everyone who's ever been born. So shout out to all the moms out there. Scotty, this feels like my first ever morning after podcast during the football season. This feels familiar to me.
Absolutely. Hey, we got a lot to break down. The picks will probably start being announced here in the next 10 or 15 minutes, and when they are announced, we will tell you as well. So we'll go through order by order. The Jazz right now, if it stands as chalk, would be picking probably 8th. But look, there's a 6% chance they fall to 10, 32 at 9, 34% at 8. And then you go up a little bit, 7% chance at 4, 6.7% chance at number 3, 6.3% chance at number 2, 6% chance at number 1. But I want to get your overall thoughts on this, Ben, before we start getting the selections. There's a lot of hate towards this year's NBA draft. And maybe hate's not the bad word, but there's a lot of people that looked at Victor last year and then maybe Cooper Flagg next year as real. I mean, obviously nobody's going to be the iconic figure that Victor could potentially be, and I think is on that trajectory. But this draft is not getting a lot of love, which I joked about on Twitter earlier today, that this would probably be the lottery that the Jazz end up winning. But from what you've heard and what you've read and who you've talked to and what you know about these players, what does this draft look like in your opinion?
I do think you want to move up, right? Because you're going to get to this point where the Jazz put in all this work and, thousands of hours and scouting different games, where the higher you get, the more likely you get to pick the player you like versus just having somebody fall to you. I do actually think there's a gap between the number one player in this draft, in my opinion, and that's Alex Sarr, the big kid from France who had played in with the G League Ignite a couple of years ago, but is now a backup playing in Australia. I think he is by far the best prospect in this draft, and while he's not Victor Wembanyama at all, I think he's going to be a real difference maker. I do think boards are going to dramatically open up after that number 1 or number 2 pick when teams are really saying, hey, who you might like at 2 or 3 truly could be on the board at 8, and there's a lot of names that could fluctuate throughout. And look, we're still far out in this process. I mean, the combine doesn't start until tomorrow. We got to get measurements on a lot of these guys that I think are actually going to be really telling in this year's draft. And then seeing how some of these guys perform. You have to participate in the combine this year, which is really cool. You don't have to do the scrimmage, unfortunately. I would have liked to have seen that, but you do have to participate, in the combine, and I think that's beneficial for NBA teams.
Well, as of right now, the Jazz, again, if it goes chalk, would select at 8, and then you've got 2 more picks at, I believe, like 29 and 32. Last year, I really never in a million years thought the Jazz would use all 3 first-round picks and keep all 3 first-round picks. But I have a hard time imagining it will happen again. But then again, it's Danny Ainge. You never know exactly what's going to happen with him when it becomes draft day. I mean, he may try to go all in and throw all the chips on the table, or he might just sit back and make some picks and continue to build. One thing we know about Danny Ainge is we just don't know anything about Danny Ainge and what his plans are.
And there are guys at the end of this first round who are young or playing overseas who you could draft and just leave overseas for a year or two and just say, yeah, you know what, we would have liked to have taken the 32nd pick and traded it for a future first or a future, expected high second-round pick. But if that's not possible, they will be prepared to make all of those picks, and there are always players in the draft now. This isn't 5, 6, 10 years ago where the players at the end of the first round were all juniors and seniors and just weren't viewed as high upside players. There's just so many one-and-done guys still in the NBA draft that are going to be available in that range that, maybe you just say, hey, we will draft you. We want to make you a first-round pick, but you're going to have to play along, and you're going to be in the G League for at least a year. And, unless things really go haywire, you're probably not going to see the floor in the NBA your first season. Are you okay with that if we draft you? And of course, players are going to say yes, and then you've got to hope they live by their word. But I think a lot of that happened with Bryce Sensabaugh last year, and they found a way to make that work and are probably happy now to still have 3 young players in the coffer coming up, and you might add 3 more this year.
You look at how the lottery looks right now. Detroit and has a 14% chance at number 1. Washington, a 14% chance at number 1. Charlotte, about a 13.3. Portland, 13.2. The Spurs, even with Victor, still have a 10% chance at number 1. Toronto at 9%. Memphis at 7.5. And then again, the Jazz at 6%. So, good chance you're looking at Detroit, Washington, or Charlotte coming away with that number 1 overall pick. The Jazz, what you want to look at is if they make it past, when the selections are made, if the Jazz aren't selecting at number 8, that means they're in the top 4. So, they can't be at number 7, they can't be at number 6, they can't be at number 5. It's either 8 or they're in the top 4. And so that's a good sign that the Jazz are moving up. But again, it is what it is. There's still going to be really good players available. And honestly, I go back to what I believe it was Ryan Smith who mentioned, it doesn't matter really where we're at in the draft. It just matters who we pick in the draft. And I know that's a really overly simplistic way of looking at it, but there's going to be great value available for the Jazz if they selected 8, 9, 10. Like, there's going to be good players available that we're going to look back 4 or 5 years from now like, wow, that guy was available at 10, or, Donovan Mitchell was available at 13, or, those guys that fall into that double-digit range or are available in the 8, that range where the Jazz probably are going to be picking, that are going to be difference makers for an organization. The matter is you just have to have your scouting department developed in such a way that you're able to identify them and find those guys that, other people overlook. And that's what it all comes down to when it comes to these days. You don't want to look back and say, well, we went Ochai Agbaji instead of this guy, or we went, Trey Lyles instead of this guy. Like, you can't have those moments in this year's draft. This is one you really need to hit on.
Yeah, and I think this year the comp for a past draft that it's received a lot of comparisons to is 2013 when Anthony Bennett went number 1 overall. We are not going to see that. We're not going to see a guy who's projected 8 or 9, I don't think, jump up and be the number 1 overall pick. I don't think it will be that big of a mystery by the time we get to draft night the way that this one was. Now, maybe there's 3 names, 4 names that are in that conversation, but there's not going to be 7 or 8 names like there were that year where I remember, Ben McLemore was getting talked about as a potential number 1 overall pick and went 7th to Sacramento. So that's not going to happen. But to your point, you've just got to find the guys and you've got to hit, because while Anthony Bennett is one of the worst number 1 picks of all time, C.J. McCollum going at number 10 to Portland ended up being a very good pick.
Yeah.
Steven Adams going at number 12 is a very good pick. Kelly Olynyk is still in the NBA. Giannis Antetokounmpo obviously is a superstar. Dennis Schroeder's still in the NBA. I mean, you can go down the list, and that's not even talking about number 27, Rudy Gobert, who the Jazz picked up, turning into a superstar. So there are always going to be players. You're right. I remember hearing Justin Zanuck on your show saying it just makes your job a little bit harder, but there's guys in every draft, you got to find them.
Yeah, and they'll be there. I mean, there's going to be guys that you're going to look at and be like, oh my gosh, this guy's a freaking superstar, and how did he last till number 9 or 10 or 11 or 14, 15? Like, that's going to happen, and there's going to be some team out there that's going to look brilliant with where they selected and who they got that ends up being a great player. And there's going to be a couple of those players in this year's NBA draft, regardless of what the talking heads may think. It's our NBA Draft Lottery Special. Scott Garrard hanging out with Ben Anderson. Hope you're having a great Mother's Day. You're spoiling Mom. And wherever you may be, hanging out at church, whether you're hanging out, driving around, going and seeing Mom, whatever the case might be, thanks for making us part of your afternoon. Ben and I will hang on the air as long as we need to. Could be a short show if the Jazz go chalk and pick where they're going to pick, or if they go top 4, we'll hang out a little longer and talk about what this means for the organization and the franchise. It's your Jazz Draft Lottery Special right here on 97.5, the KSL Sports Zone. Welcome back. It's our NBA Draft Lottery Special right here on the Zone. Scott Garrard, Ben Anderson with you as we give you all these selections pick by pick, as we'll find out exactly what the order of the upcoming NBA Draft will look like. Do the Jazz move up, or do they stay put? Could they slip a little bit? Good chance they'll probably be in that number 9 or number 8 range. You're looking at probably about a combined 65-70% chance that that's what happens, that the Jazz will stay there. But, hey, like they say, there's always a chance, Ben, and the Jazz could reasonably move up to the top 4 of this year's NBA draft. You want to, and that certainly is the hope, and you would love to, if nothing else, it just gives you more options, more ability to change things up and maybe entertain some other options that may be available to you. So I know we joke about this would be the year that the Jazz could win a NBA draft lottery just because of what might be available and the stereotype out there that this isn't a particularly good draft. But again, you want options, and so yes, even though there may not be a Victor Wembanyama in this year's draft, you still hope you're top 4 at least, and it gives you just a plethora of different options to work with.
Yeah, and Scotty, not that the Jazz wouldn't gladly take a Victor Wembanyama or a Cooper Flagg next year or any of these superstars at the top of the draft, and they still need that guy. Don't get me wrong, they need that guy. But they don't need it even as badly as a Washington Wizards need that guy. So when you're looking at some of these teams at the top of the draft, when we're talking about this not being a good draft, it's really bad if you're a team like Washington who needs the other guy, maybe even Portland, like after Scoot Henderson is looking like he may not be that superstar a lot of people had hoped. Then you might be in trouble. But if you're just looking for players who can come in, be very high-level role players, maybe, tease an all-star game or 2 in their careers, I actually think there is some talent in this draft, and the Jazz fit there. Now, would they love to find the diamond in the rough who turns into that all-star? Absolutely. Or a superstar? Absolutely. But it's not like this draft is devoid of talent. It just doesn't have that superstar if you're trying to rebuild your franchise that it was worth tanking an entire season over.
If you're drafting for need right now, Ben, what are you drafting for?
I think the Jazz need another wing still next to Lauri Markkanen. I think you need another guy who can play with Taylor Hendricks and Markkanen and maybe space the floor, but really add a lot defensively. I think that's going to be the key for the Jazz. It is funny. We talk about offensive players, Scotty, and it's like, well, if you need better offense, go get a 20-point-per-game player. Well, look, if you need a defensive player or you need to improve the defense on your roster, get a defensive player. And there are defensive players in this lottery, and I think the Jazz could go in that direction with a few different guys that are A-plus defenders. I think Alex Sarr, who I mentioned, who I think is going to be the number 1 overall pick, is a great defensive player. There are players out there who have stepped up. Stephon Castle with UConn is a big-time defensive player. Klingen's a big-time defensive player also from UConn. And I think you're going to find some help in that regard if that's the direction the Jazz look.
Let's say that the Jazz do pick at 8 or 9. Do you anticipate that they do draft by need, or do you anticipate that they draft just the old school best player available?
One of the things Danny Ainge has said is that when you start getting into tiers of this draft, which I think the tier is going to look like like I've said, I think this Alex Sarr player is going to be the number 1 in a tier by himself, and even the NBA kind of did a pre-draft, not lottery, but looking at who the top 10 prospects are, and he was in a class by himself. He's number 1. There's a next class with maybe 2 or 3 guys in it, and then once you start get 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, I think that's a bigger tier where most players are pretty even. And in that sense, I think the Jazz start going for need more so than just raw best player available because they think they could get on the floor and play a little bit earlier.
Big T, Thurl Bailey trying to provide a little good luck. And, I mean, let's be honest, Thurl Bailey's, life has been good for Thurl Bailey. I mean, great basketball player, great singer, great human being, humble, one of the nicest dudes you'll ever meet. He is representing the Utah Jazz on the podium. And so, you know what? Maybe Big T's the good luck charm that the Jazz need to move up in the draft. You're hard-pressed to find a better person to represent the Jazz than Big T.
Yeah, it's a nice option. Jake and I had talked on our show about, who would you throw out there? We talked about, maybe Ron Boone if you can get him off the golf course. Thurl Bailey makes total sense. If you're getting Thurl out there, he's really the kind of going back and doing our 50 greatest players in Jazz history and some of the research we did with that last year. His arrival was such a huge change for the Utah Jazz. It's when everything started to take off, and they really never stopped winning once Thurl got there. I know John and Carl get so much credit for that, but Thurl was a huge part of that. So, yeah, throw him out there. Hopefully he's the good luck that the Jazz have needed.
People forget the kind of numbers that Thurl Bailey put up at some points in his early part of his career. I mean, Thurl was a scoring machine. Like, there was some look, you're right. John and Carl get a lot of love, but if you go back and I would, for all you kids out there, pull up some YouTube video, go to Basketball Reference, and check out the career that Thurl Bailey had, because he's more than just a good broadcaster. He was a heck of a player back in the day. So here we go as we get closer to seeing the picks being announced. As we mentioned, the Jazz have when you look at how things are going to play out, the Jazz have a 6% chance of staying put, or excuse me, a 34% chance at staying at number 8. They do have a 32% chance of slipping to number 9, and a small percentage that they have two teams that jump ahead of them and could fall to 6.7%. Other than that, they could move up to 4. There's a 7% chance of that, 6.7 that they go to 3, 6.3% chance at number 2, and a 6% chance that they go number 1. So, Ben, this is crystal ball time. You get to make a projection. You think some magic happens today for the Jazz?
Sure, it's overdue. I mean, how many times have they been in the lottery and had no luck? The one time they did, it wasn't their pick. It was the Brooklyn Nets pick for Ennis Freedom, Ennis Cantor at the time. So, why not have a little bit of luck here? I think it would be fun for the Jazz. And like you said, it would be a little bit fitting that maybe this isn't the year you're as worried about moving up into the top 4 as you would be.
So the Detroit Pistons and the Washington Wizards are tied for the highest odds. They both have a 14% chance of getting the number 1 spot, and Charlotte right there behind them at 13.3, as well as Portland at 13.2. Here we go. We got the stack of envelopes ready to be released by the NBA. Now, remember, this lottery has already happened. This has happened several hours ago, so this has already been the order has already been established, as Mark Tatum, the NBA Deputy Commissioner and Chief Operating Officer, will be the one that will announce the order once again. And here we go, folks, with number 14. Odds are it'll be the Golden State Warriors. Nope, it's the Portland Trailblazers.
That pick belongs to Portland from Golden State.
You're right. Yeah, right. Yeah, that's Portland. Yep. So Portland will be picking at number 14. And now here comes number 13. That is the Sacramento Kings that will be picking at number 13. So now it's time to get number 12. That is the Oklahoma City Thunder from the Houston Rockets. So they will be selecting at number 12. Here comes the number 11th overall selection, and that will be the Chicago Bulls. Will be picking at number 11. All right, coming off the board fast and furious, here comes number 10, Mark Tatum. Oh, the Jazz fall all the way down to number 10, Ben.
That's a huge drop, obviously.
Wow.
Because that means that the two teams at 9 and 8, both, or at 10 and 9, both jump the Jazz. That means the Atlanta Hawks with Quinn Snyder are going to climb into the top 4, as are the Houston Rockets. They're going to jump up there as well. So that's crazy. That's a Houston Rockets pick, again from the Brooklyn Nets. Brooklyn lost a top lottery pick to the Jazz. They lost a top lottery pick to Danny Ainge and the Boston Celtics. It turned into Jason Tatum, and now they've lost another one that's going to go to the Rockets in the James Harden trade.
Yeah, so the Jazz fall to 6 points. That was a 6% chance of that happening, and that is indeed what happened. The Jazz fall from 8 to 10. So that is where the Jazz will be selecting in the upcoming NBA draft at number 10, not number 8, not number 9, and not into the top 4. So let's talk about what that means for this Jazz team right now, as we'll give you the rest of the order coming up here in a bit. But I think the most important thing here is just talking about where the Jazz, what that ends up meaning for this Jazz team overall. I mean, obviously you're looking at it limits your options a little bit, certainly, but not necessarily the kind of player you're going to get.
You know, looking at this, Scotty, I had really kind of looked at 5-6 names that I was pretty confident were going to be on the board at either 8 or 9. And I said, as long as I think you're in that grouping, you're probably okay. Once you start getting to 10, 11, 12, 13, some of those names that Jazz fans have probably looked up, guys I've written about already, Ron Holland, Modest Buzelis, Cody Williams, a lot of these guys all of a sudden there's scenarios where none of them are on the board and you can't get that big wing size you were hoping for, and you're starting to look at this fourth tier in the draft. There's that number one tier I told you, which I think is Alex Sarr, maybe Zachary Riz-Shea. Then there's the second tier, which has 2 or 3 more names. The third tier has 5 or 6 names. Now you're at 10, and you're either just taking whoever falls to you, or you're starting to reach into that next tier a little bit. So this is honestly, it's just a brutal outcome for the Utah Jazz. That's about as bad as it could get. Had they fallen to 11, they would have lost it overall. But 6%, they had a better likelihood, Scotty, of moving up to the number 1 overall pick than they did falling to 10. And of course, they got the worst outcome.
Yep. Just looking at several, mock drafts before we went on the air, you look at a guy like Castle, who, there's some that thought he might slip to 8. That probably won't. He's definitely not going to last to 10.
No,
the freshman from UConn. I don't think Reed Shepherd was a guy that would probably be, probably not on the Jazz board. But those, or the Ron Holland, Cody Williams from Colorado, those guys are going to be gone by the time you get to 10. So it does limit your options a little bit, but now you wonder if the Jazz use a little bit of that capital to maybe move up 2 or 3 spots.
And that is one of the things, Scotty, I think you're right on, where you've got the 29th pick, you've got the 32nd pick. If there's a guy at 8 that you love and you have to move up, I think you can probably move up to get him. In fact, they could have last year, and they didn't want to give up that 28th pick that turned into Bryce Sensabaugh. They didn't want to trade that to move up a spot, is my understanding, and they stayed place at 9 to draft Taylor Hendricks.
So the Jazz will not be selecting in the top 4. I actually felt pretty good that this might be a good year for the Jazz, but in normal Jazz luck, they end up, when there's a 6% chance of something really good happening and a 6% chance of something really bad happening, what really bad happened, and the Jazz slipped from a 35% chance of being at number 8, a 34% chance of being at number 9, to a 6% chance of being number 10. Well, that 6% hits, and they slip all the way back to number 10. So as we get back to it, we'll announce who will be the top 4 selections. As you mentioned, the Jazz are leapfrogged by Houston and by Atlanta. So it's a good day for Quinn Snyder. He's going to have a little bit more to work with in terms of what his selection could be looking like for the Hawks. But this is not great. This is not great for the Jazz, and certainly the now you have to be a little bit more creative in the offseason. Now the Jazz have known this for a bit. They were in the lottery. This has already happened. So I got to imagine the wheels in Danny Ainge's head are already spinning on what he wants to do here at number 10, as opposed to potentially being at number 1, 2, 3, 4, or number 8 or number 9. So a lot of work to be done here for the Jazz, but certainly not without the realm of possibilities. We mentioned I talked to somebody that was in the draft room a couple of years ago during Danny Ainge's first draft, and they said that Danny was going through, hey, you know what, would you like to get this guy? But he's like, yeah, let's go get him. He's like, well, we can't because we don't have any assets.
You got nothing to do with it.
And and he was kind of poking the bear a little bit because of the fact that Jazz had no assets available to them. Well, this year's not going to be the case. This is going to be far more entertaining draft for the Jazz and Danny Ainge, because he can will and deal a little bit more than he has been able to in the past. And obviously it takes 2 to tango, but we'll see exactly what happens there for the Jazz. So you look at the draft order right now. You got Washington still on the board with some opportunities to make something happen. You've got San Antonio, Houston, and, of course, the Atlanta Hawks are your 4 that could be viable for the number 1 overall pick in this year's NBA draft. So here comes Mark Tatum announcing the number 4 overall selection, and that will go to the San Antonio Spurs. So the Spurs will be picking at number 4. So they own the 4th and 8th pick, so they've got some leverage. Houston will be at number 3. How about this? Could we see the Hawks getting the number 1 overall pick, Ben? This is crazy. It is. Washington will pick 2, and the Atlanta Hawks, Ben, are going to move all the way up to number 1. How about that?
that's a pretty ideal situation. It just gives them so many options this summer now with whether to keep Trae Young or move on from Trae Young. There were some questions of how do they really improve their roster. Having the number 1 overall pick significantly helps that situation. They can go out and get another major piece to try and build around. So a big win there. And obviously that's the twisting of the knife for the Utah Jazz, who worked so hard to pass both Brooklyn and Atlanta in the tanking rankings late in the season. The Jazz lost so many games specifically to pass those teams, and what happens? Those teams that the Jazz leapt both jumped them in the lottery.
Yep. Atlanta came into this thing, by the way, with only a 3% chance of getting the number 1 overall pick. There was a 65.9% chance they would be at number 10, but yet they move all the way up to number 1 with just a 3% chance, and they will be selecting at number 1. And you're right, the Jazz were right there with Atlanta down the stretch, and certainly could have been in that number 10 spot. Instead, they improve their odds to number 8 and yet fall back to number 10. And it's just kind of how things go sometimes. So the Jazz will be selecting at number 10 in this year's NBA draft. We'll take a break, continue on. You're listening to your NBA Draft Lottery special. Scott Garrard, Ben Anderson, right here on 97.5, the KSL Sports Zone. Welcome back. It's the NBA Draft Lottery Special. Scott Garrard, Ben Anderson. Jazz fall from number 8 to number 10 in the lottery. They were, odds are at number 8, high chance at number 9. Instead, they fall all the way back to number 10. There's only a 6.7% chance that could happen, and it did. Here's your other storyline, Ben, that was interesting. So San Antonio, Toronto had that pick and had, again, it gone chalk. They would have been selecting at number 4. But because they got, there were 2 teams that leapfrogged over the top of them, that pick gets pushed to 8, which means that it then got conveyed to San Antonio because it was protected as a top 6 pick. So now, because Toronto's pick got pushed down to 8, they lose that pick. It goes to San Antonio. So San Antonio now gets the number 4 and number 8 overall picks. So they get 2 top 10 picks out of this.
Yeah, that was just like the Jazz made a big push late in the season to tank to ensure a top 10 pick, which ultimately is what happened at number 10. Toronto also wanted to tank so they could hold on to that pick, lost, I think, 15 games in a row at one point, and still ended up losing that draft pick. So while Jazz fans might be licking their wounds after dropping 2 spots and having, I guess, one of the worst outcomes possible, it's certainly not as bad as what Toronto fans were put through.
Well, and if you're San Antonio, you get Victor last year, and then you get number 4 and number 8 this year. You could certainly be on your way to a nice rebuild pretty quickly there for the Spurs.
Yeah, absolutely. 2 more pieces if you needed to even package them and move up. If there was a player you thought you had to have at 2, I would imagine you could probably do that. So if you wanted to move up, you can. But yeah, you just keep loading out this talent with, or this roster with young talent. So smart move and good team building from San Antonio. We will see which types of players they end up with, but they're going to get likely a guard who they want to pair with Victor Wembanyama, and then they'll get whatever wing or whoever they think is the next best fit there. So going to be a fun pre-draft process. I'm really curious what this means for the Utah Jazz. There's, like you mentioned, Stephen Castle's a name you can stop talking about. Zachary Rizachet probably out of the conversation. Alexander Sarr out of the conversation. And then it starts getting a little bit more interesting in some of these names that could still be on the board at 10. And again, every year, the last week or 2 leading up to it, a couple of names jump up, and you start to hear buzz that they're going to go in the top 10. Last year, it was Wembanyama's teammate, Bilal Coulibaly, who ended up going in front of where even the Jazz were picking, who was kind of a guy who was projected around the 20s, who got some late buzz and ended up in the high lottery.
Bart Taylor, Vice President of Player Personnel for the Utah Jazz, will join or will address the media coming up here in just a moment. And when that goes down, we'll carry it live and get his thoughts on exactly, the immediate Jazz reaction to where they're going to be selecting at number 10. All right, so let's talk about the kind of player, and we touched on this briefly, but you look at who might be available at that spot. The net kid from Tennessee, perhaps. I'm looking at maybe Devin Carter from Providence, Jacoby Walter from Baylor. I don't know if Reed Shepherd's the kind of guy that appeals to you at all.
I honestly don't think Reed's going to fall that far. I just think he's going to go in, and because he's maybe the best shooter I've ever seen in my life, someone's going to fall in love with him. I would be stunned, actually, unless, San Antonio picks a guard at 4, which is very possible they could, whoever falls to them. I would really see Reed Shepherd as a landing spot in San Antonio with one of those 2 picks. I just don't think he falls that far out of it. He'd also really fit with Charlotte. So when you get down to 10 now, you're right. I mean, you're talking about Dalton Knecht from Tennessee, who's 23. If you want to take a guy who's that much older, you can. That doesn't usually work out in the lottery. Cody Williams is maybe the name. If I were a Jazz fan, I would hope is still on the board. I could see him being a name that goes and has really good workouts and impresses people with his size in the pre-draft process. But if he's there at 10, I think he'd be a very good option because he has size. He's obviously the younger brother of Jalen Williams, the star with the Oklahoma City Thunder right now. And then even another name I think you start to key in on, Isaiah Collier at USC. Yeah. Even Kyle Filipowski probably enters the conversation out of Duke. I know some Jazz fans don't like the idea of taking another center, but very realistically, those are the types of players I think you're looking at.
You got a guy, and look, I'll be honest, I don't know much about him. Zachary Rossiker from France is another guy that could be on the mix. But here's Bart Taylor addressing the media. A few minutes out, so we'll get to that coming up here in a bit. But again, those are the names you probably should be looking at in terms of what might be available at number 10 for the Utah Jazz. But again, bottom line is this: the Jazz have assets. If they identify somebody in that probably 5 to 8 range that they really like, then they probably have the ammunition to go out and get him. I don't know if they can get up too much higher than that. But again, there will be some opportunities available for the Jazz to wheel and deal. At least they'll have the option to do that they haven't had in the past. So if one thing we know about Danny Ainge is that, look, the dude's aggressive, and if he sees somebody he wants, he's going to go out there and do everything in his power to go out and get him. But, at this point, Ben, you mentioned you want to go wing, you want to go a little bit more defense. I don't know what your opportunities are going to be available at number 10, but certainly that's going to be a high priority of this Jazz going forward.
Yeah, I think it is. And, maybe you trade this pick. I mean, maybe it's just more likely you don't make this pick at all now that you've fallen to number 10, whereas in the past that was certainly an option. I think you were keying in on wanting to add the type of talent that if you don't think is going to be there at 10, you might find yourself in trouble. Now, look, I can go back and look at my tweets a week and a half ago. I said, man, there are more guys in this draft 10 to 20 that aren't getting much love that I think are real players. And I actually think there's some help there. Now, again, you don't want to fall to 10. You want to draft as high as possible, and it gives you the best chance to get the type of size you want, and that's something I think Danny Ainge is really focused in on adding for the Utah Jazz. But there will still be size and good players at number 10 on this board. It's not the ideal outcome for the Jazz. It's far from it. But I still think there's going to be players on the board at 10 that, if they're intrigued by them, they can feel very confident in who they're getting.
Well, and again, it just it cracks me up as you mentioned that the Jazz worked so hard down the stretch to make sure that their draft capital was as good as they possibly could, as good as it possibly could be, and the fact that that a team that they worked hard to get in front of ends up getting the number 1 overall pick in Atlanta.
It was both of them. It was Brooklyn and Atlanta.
Yeah,
I mean, those were the two teams the Jazz really focused in on trying to leap. And I remember, looking at it over the last month and a half of the season, 2 months of the season, since mid-February of, can they pass Atlanta? And it was like, well, there's a 3-game gap between the Jazz and the Nets. I don't think they can catch the Nets as bad as Brooklyn's playing because, again, Brooklyn doesn't own their own pick. That pick's going to be traded or is already belonging to the Houston Rockets. I thought, okay, well, they've got no reason to try and lose games. I guess maybe the Jazz could get there, and they overtake them in those last couple of weeks. And, of course, as you're mentioning, those are the two teams that leap the Jazz and go into the top 4, including the Hawks, who end up with the number 1 overall pick. Just truly maybe the worst-case scenario for the Jazz on that front.
Yep.
And it will certainly make people invoke the basketball gods and messing with the cosmos of the NBA.
Well, yeah, I know. That's what you get sometimes, I guess. But the Jazz right now will be selecting at number 10, at number 29, and at number 32. So 3 first-round picks for the Utah Jazz like they had last year, but right now selecting at number 10, 29, and 32 as they try to rebuild this thing for the future. And I would love to have been a fly on the wall seeing Danny Ainge's face in that in the ping pong ballroom when he found out that he dropped a couple spots. And again, a little bit of a kick to the gut for the Utah Jazz when the odds are that, not worst case, but the most likely worst case scenario would have been falling to 9, but falling to number 10 just I know has deflated a lot of Jazz fans coming up on Mother's Day. Not particularly pleased with how that played out. And but you know what? You still have some options available to you, and you'll go from there. But what this means for the Jazz is that, you look at some of the players that might be available, and you look at what could be there. Stephon Castle, as you mentioned, Ben, a guy that may have been there at number 8. He's probably out of the mix. Reed Sheppard, probably out of the mix. Cody Williams, do you think he might be a guy that could be there at 10?
That would be the name. If I were a Jazz fan early in this process, I would circle and say that might be best case scenario at this point. And look, I thought he was in play at number 8 if he were to get there. As far as he was a huge recruit still coming out of high school. He's out of Arizona. Again, his brother has NBA DNA. Jalen Williams, probably the second best player with the Oklahoma City Thunder right now. And we remember seeing him in the WCC going up against BYU. Scotty, so that's a familiar name, but that's his younger brother. He's actually taller than his younger brother. Shot over 40% from 3. The problem is he just didn't take a whole lot of threes. But the issue with Cody Williams, not to get too geeky on his breakdown, Scotty, is just that he played on a team that has 2 other older players who are NBA players as well, and he kind of deferred to them quite a bit. They also had a center that was 6'8" and 300 pounds who just stood in the middle of the paint and took up space, which is fine. It really works in college. It's just not really what an NBA design looks like. So the type of spacing he would benefit from in the NBA, if you could convince him to shoot the ball more where he shot at a very high percentage, he's a top-tier athlete, again, has NBA DNA. That's the type of player who I think might be best-case scenario for the Jazz. I don't know if he's still going to be on the board at number 10, but one of these things that I always kind of find myself doing is, look, 9 guys do have to get drafted before him. You can't draft 13 guys before you get to number 10, so somebody is still going to be on that board in this conversation that the Jazz are looking at.
Dalton Connect, another guy from Tennessee. You mentioned certainly on the older side. He was a senior. You don't see a lot of, unfortunately now in this day and age, if you're a senior coming out in the draft, people are wondering what's wrong with you. Why weren't you in the NBA a lot earlier? But great shooter, not a particularly good defensive player, but a guy who can really shoot the ball. That's another guy that could be available there at 10.
Absolutely. Has NBA size, was the SEC Player of the Year last year, and he has transferred up, I think, twice. I think he started at a community college, went to a smaller college, and then transferred up again. And his game followed him everywhere he went. I think there was a lot of doubt that, he would continue to upscale his game as he went up against better and better competition, and he did. He kept playing better. But again, he's 23 playing against a bunch of 18-year-olds. So how much of a gap is that? How much of an advantage of that? His body is pretty close to finish. But he's going to go in the lottery. Someone's going to take a chance on him. You mentioned Jacoby Walter, another name that I think is going to get in this conversation as well. So I'm curious. I'm really curious to hear what we hear from the Jazz coming up here momentarily as they talk about this pick and what they think about their poor luck of dropping to number 10.
And I've been burnt a little bit on this in the past, so I'm always going to be a little careful because, you look at a guy that, I watched, with my ties to Utah State, I saw Paul George a ton in college at Fresno State. His team not only did they not go to the NCAA tournament, his team's never made it above 500 at Fresno. I mean, they were just miserable teams while he was there. Damian Lillard never made it to the NCAA tournament, never could get out of the Big Sky Conference tournament. And sometimes you think, okay, you need to elevate your team if you are a high NBA draft pick to be a high winning team at the collegiate level. That certainly isn't the case. But I look at a guy like Jacoby Walter, and he didn't necessarily pop at Baylor, but I do think that he's got the dimensions and the skill set to be a really special player. Now, he wasn't as good as I think a lot of people were hoping he'd be at Baylor, and didn't, again, necessarily pop the way that I think a lot of people thought he would. But doesn't mean that he can't be kind of a Chris Middleton player at the next level. No,
I think that's a good comp. He's a little bit smaller, obviously, but you're right. It's the type of player who was a huge recruit coming out of high school, underachieves a little bit, and sometimes that's just role. You never know what's going on there. Keontae George was the number 5 recruit, went to Baylor and played a little bit out of position and they have money to get recruits, and that doesn't always mean the players choose the best spot for their NBA future. Sometimes they just choose the place that can give them the most money. Can I give you a quick rundown of some of the past number 10 overall picks?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Jazz fans, I think, might be interested in that. Last year, Cason Wallace went number 10 overall. He is a rookie. He is playing for the Oklahoma City Thunder right now in the playoffs. Johnny Davis is arguably the worst pick we've seen in the NBA draft over the last 3 years by the Washington Wizards. Now, he just doesn't play. He's not on the floor. He doesn't look like he has much of an NBA future. Zaire Williams doesn't play much for the Memphis Grizzlies, was a weird top 10 pick that they had via trade. Jalen Smith by the Phoenix Suns is already on the Indiana Pacers, and I don't know if he's hurt right now, but it's turned into an okay player, but never became a guy for Phoenix. Cam Reddish, obviously a major bust, has played for, I think, 4 teams already in his NBA career. But then you start getting into guys like Mikal Bridges, who comes out of Villanova at number 10, who's a big-time difference maker. Before that, C.J. McCollum in 2013 was the 10th overall pick. You hope you're avoiding Jimmer Fredette, who was the number 10 overall pick in 2011, but a name you already mentioned, Scotty Paul George, was the 10th overall pick in 2010. So it is a spot where I think historically you get guys who have a couple of things working against them, so they fall out of that top 5, top 6, top 7, and they get overlooked, and you focus more on the things they can't do, and you forget about the things they can do, and then they're sitting on the board at number 10, and you hope you pick that guy up, and he develops into the Paul Pierce, Paul George type, both number 10 overall picks, and not so much the Thon Maker, Cam Reddish types that I mentioned.
I want to recap while we wait for Bart Taylor to address the media here momentarily. A couple of games last night. How about Dallas? Look, now up 2-1 against the Thunder. They win that game yesterday, 105-101. Really fun game down the stretch in that one as Luka continues to do his thing. And but at the end, it was Kyrie Irving, that beautiful floater, to push that lead up to 5 points down the stretch. And the Kyrie experiment has worked very well down the stretch of the season for the Dallas Mavericks. He seems like he's figured things out, how he and Luka can be on the court at the same time. And now look at the Thunder, who after game 1 felt like, okay, they're on their way to the Western Conference Finals, and now Dallas has reeled off 2 in a row and have taken command of that series.
Yeah, and that was always going to be the question with Oklahoma City is, are they too young and are they too small? And I think you saw a little bit of that where Chet Holmgren's a great player. He's going to be very good. He's in his first real NBA year. I know he was in the league last year but didn't get to play at all. He's in his first time ever in these situations. He didn't play huge games. I mean, he played in some because Gonzaga always makes runs in the playoffs, but he's expected now to be a difference maker in the NBA postseason going up against Kyrie Irving, who's hit one of the most iconic shots in NBA Finals history over Steph Curry to win a title in Cleveland. You've got Luka Doncic, who's one of the best players on the planet. That's just going to be a lot to ask for that young Oklahoma City core. And I think that's going to be something that plagues them the rest of the way.
We'll talk about the Celtics-Cavaliers series here in a second, but let's go to Bart Taylor, Vice President of Player Personnel, after the Jazz are selecting at number 10 in this year's NBA draft.
Obviously not happy about it. Would rather stay at 8 or move up. But we're still, we've been studying the draft already for the 8th pick, and there's still a lot of players there that we like, and I think we'll still get a good player at 10, so not too worried about it.
Ryan Miller?
Yeah, kind of along those lines. Does this change your draft plans at all?
I don't think it changes our plans. I think what it'll do is actually potentially give us more access to players. Being at 8, as you move higher up in the draft, you get access to less players because people don't believe that they're actually going to, the agents do their work to see where their guys will go. And so I think by falling to 10, we actually are going to have more access to guys that, maybe the guys that are going to go 14, 15, 16, we can convince them to come in for number 10 rather than number 8. So it may actually, in a weird way, give us more access to players.
Andy Larson?
Yeah. Obviously at the Combine and learning more about this draft over the last month or so, how much is it solidifying it, or does it still feel as kind of up in the air as it did, when we talked last, like that this is a unique draft?
I think for our group, it's solidified more internally. But I think where it's very fluid is just, I think our top 10 could be very different from every other team's top 10, for example, this year. So I think that's where it gets interesting, especially kind of after the first 5 picks. Or I think probably like half the guys we have in the top 10 are probably in everybody's top 10, right? But I don't know which half that is. So I think it like gets interesting around 6, 7, where we could have a lot of people that it's going to be like beauty in the eye of the beholder, right? Like I think it could get, I think it's similar to like the Anthony Bennett draft, where you just didn't know who was going to go 1, and then kind of everyone's just picking guys that they have a preference on and they like more than others. So I think it'll be interesting.
Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, well, kind of without a lack of consensus at the top, does that like change how teams are going to like approach trades in this draft? Is it easier, quote unquote, to get up there than in most drafts?
Yeah, I mean, the price might be lower. I don't know. We'll have those conversations throughout this process and see. Like it might, but I think on the flip side of like how motivated are you to move up if the player, if you're not sure that the player is going to be an all-star player either. So I think it's kind of like double-edged sword, right? It might be cheaper to move up, but do you still want to move up, or are you just going to live with whoever ends up at your pick?
Andy?
Have you guys done any draft workouts in-house yet?
Yes, we had a couple last week.
Okay. Do you anticipate, how many do you anticipate doing? Do you anticipate doing more than a normal year, less, kind of the same? What do you hope to do with that?
Hopefully the same. I mean, we try to get a lot of guys in every year. I mean, we used to announce them, and you guys knew how many people were coming in, and we've stayed around that number ever since I've gotten here, and we like to get a lot of people in our building. I think it helps us get to know guys, obviously, and get to see them on a more personal level, but then also they get to see Salt Lake, and the summertime's pretty nice out there, so it's a good little sales pitch as well for whenever the guy becomes available in the future if we don't draft him.
Yeah, do you think the likelihood that you'll keep all 3 picks, or is that not something you guys are looking at wanting to do?
I get that question a lot, not just from media people, but around the league. The most basic answer is just, yeah, we're like right now, we don't have any trades that we've executed on to trade them. We're going to have conversations around our picks. We're definitely open to discussing them with everybody around the league. But as of today, we have all 3 picks. So the way we operate is that we have to select them. So I think, again, everyone wants to know, what are you going to do with all 3 picks? And until someone offers us something that we like to trade one of them, we're going to pick them.
Andy?
Bart, were you relieved that you didn't fall to 11, which would have meant losing the pick?
I mean, I'm happy we kept it. Obviously, I think having a top 10 pick is always better than not having it. But if it had fallen to 11, then we'd be done with that protection to OKC as well. So, I mean, we made that trade, and it's kind of a sunk cost at this point. So whatever happens, I think, with that.
Any other questions? All right. Looks like we're all good. Thank you so much, Bart, for taking some time.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us.
So there you go. That's Bart Taylor, Vice President of Player Personnel, trying to put a positive spin. Ben said, hey, look, this puts us at more play. There's probably more players that will come in for workouts knowing that we're at number 10 and number 8. Sometimes agents won't send their guys thinking that there's no way the Jazz will be selecting them anyway, so why bother? He thinks that it'll probably open things up a little bit more. Somebody that might be slotted at 14 to 16 or 17 might take that trip to Salt Lake City where they wouldn't have otherwise. I don't know. Is that just trying to make the best out of a bad situation, or do you think there's some validity to that?
No, I think there's some validity to that. There are guys like, Kyle Filipowski, who I mentioned already, who probably isn't coming into Utah at number 8 to work out because there's no realistic situation where he lands there, and now the Jazz can say, well, hey, it's not that crazy in this draft if maybe you're number 20 on one board, that actually you could be number 10 on our board. 17 on their board is going to be number 15, or 12 on our board, but there's a chance you could get up to 10. The Jazz have those options now that they could pitch to these players and maybe get a few more of them in. And I do think the important thing to remember is just because you work a guy out doesn't mean you're all that interested in drafting him, but you do like gathering intel on who they are before their second contract. And, the example I would give you there is Jordan Clarkson, who the Jazz liked in the draft, didn't have a pick, I think, near the end of the first round where he got selected, early second round where he got selected, but had that intel on him from when they had talked and had always tracked him because of how much they liked him. So when he becomes available, they go out and get that guy. So that is valuable. Now, it may not pay off until 3-4 years down the road, or maybe it never does. But those are the types of things that front offices are doing that have maybe kind of some unforeseen value that doesn't show up otherwise.
Well, and he brought up a good point, too, where I think it's a very valuable one, is that, you're able to essentially get an early sales pitch on maybe that next when free agency hits, or making a trade a little bit more palatable for a player because he's been to Salt Lake. He's seen the facilities. He's seen what Salt Lake is like during the summer, and it's not a bad place at all during the summer for sure. And so, and the one thing the Jazz have done and continue to do is really invest into all their resources, and so in terms of facilities and all of that, the Jazz are next to, I mean, they're as good as anybody in the league right now. So when a player comes in and sees what's there, the conditions, the resources that Ryan Smith has poured into the program, and then 3 or 4 years from now, as you mentioned, there's, whether it's a free agency or trade or whatever the case might be, like, oh yeah, I was there. There was a lot of good stuff there. And they've really poured into their resources. And at that point, you're going to have a new revamped arena as well. So it sets the stage early to try to sow those seeds of a good impression by the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just a chance to get guys in. And, hey, if the guy's 18 on most people's boards and the number 10 team is talking to him as well, maybe that says, hey, this team likes me. Maybe in the future I will like that as well. Again, there are parts where you can do favors for agents, do favors for players, make everybody a little bit happier. And then, there are, maybe some of the international players who wouldn't have come over and worked out for the Jazz at number 8. They would have only seen them at the Combine, are now names that you do get a one-on-one workout with, which are a couple of these higher upside guys who, Tijon Saloon is a name that I think will actually get a lot of run for the Utah Jazz right now, who is the Giannis Antetokounmpo of this draft. Kind of unknown, super young, playing in France, crazy body and athleticism, who sometimes you watch and you're like, what are you doing? Have you ever played basketball before? And then sometimes you watch him and you're like, that's the greatest physical specimen I've ever seen in my life, which again is very Giannis Antetokounmpo, who was drafted off the top of my head, what was it, 15, 16 in the 2013 draft, where Bart Taylor just said, the guy that they would compare this to is the Anthony Bennett draft, which again is the Giannis Antetokounmpo draft also.
Well, Ben, we appreciate it. Thanks for carving out some time for us on your Mother's Day. Hopefully you get a chance to celebrate all the moms in your life. Mine as well. Looking forward to it. But again, may not have gone the way the Jazz would have hoped, but still, you got a top 10 pick to work with. So thanks for everybody for listening. Thanks for hanging out with us on your Sunday afternoon. Jazz thought they might be at number 8. Good chance at number 9. Hope to be top 4, but instead we'll be picking at number 10. We'll have, if you missed any part of our initial projections on this and our initial thoughts, this will be available on podcast form, both on the Hans and Scotty feed and the Jake and Ben feed as well. So that'll be available for you there, the entire show, including the comments you just heard from Bart Taylor. And we'll be back at it tomorrow, breaking it all down, what this means for the Utah Jazz. But Ben, thanks for hanging out, man. We appreciate it.
My pleasure, Scotty. Thanks for doing this.
Well, to kick it off tomorrow, DJ and PK will start things tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. and all-day coverage, not only of the NBA Draft Lottery, but all the playoff games as well. Thanks for listening. Big thanks to Lloyd Cole and Alex Napoli back in studio, keeping us on the air as well. Hans and Scotty coming up tomorrow at noon. Jake and Ben tomorrow beginning at 10 right here on 97.5, the KSL Sports Zone.
Pick number 10 will be made by the Utah Jazz.
This means that Atlanta and Houston have both moved into the top 4. You see those smiles.